sex abuse crisis. New details out of the Vatican on a global summit to address the scandal. We're in Rome. Border debate. The White House says it's willing to work with Congress to avert a government shutdown. Going to Washington. A pro-life lawmaker in Arizona who lost her Senate race is headed to Capitol Hill after all. And a new chapter. How an author and Catholic educator is helping young readers develop their moral imagination. On EWTN News Nightly for Tuesday, December 18, 2018. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for News from a Catholic Perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby, in for Lauren Ashburn. For the first time, the Vatican is revealing details of a global summit on clergy sex abuse. Organizers are urging participants to meet with victims personally before coming to Rome in late February.
Anytime you speak with a victim, I think any normal person changes their ideas. It touches them much more closely, and they realize exactly how grave it is, and it makes a difference in terms of how you deal with it from then on.
The sex abuse and cover-up scandal erupted in the U.S., Chile, and elsewhere earlier this year. Pope Francis has invited church leaders to a meeting to respond to what has become the gravest threat to his pontificate. Vatican correspondent Juliet Lindley joins us from Rome. Juliet, what are you learning about this historic meeting?
Wyatt, organizers are warning that the credibility of the Catholic Church is in jeopardy over the abuse scandal. In a letter to bishops' conferences around the world, they say the Church must develop a comprehensive response to the crisis, and the first step is acknowledging the truth of what's happened. The letter was signed by the 4 members of the preparatory committee for the summit, and they're Cardinal Blaise Cupich of Chicago, Cardinal Oswald Gracious of India, Father Hans Zollner, who heads the Pope's Commission on Safeguarding Minors, and Vatican abuse investigator Archbishop Charles Scicluna.
The Vatican is asking bishops to meet with victims ahead of the meeting. What will participants focus on when they actually meet?
Well, Greg Burke, the head of the Holy See press office, says the focus of the gathering is going to be on 3 key areas: responsibility, accountability, and transparency. Burke says meeting with victims is a concrete way of putting victims first and acknowledging the horror of the abuse. Organizers say the goal is to learn firsthand the suffering survivors have endured. They say if they don't craft a comprehensive response, the Church will have failed to bring healing to survivors.
And this is not necessarily just about the Church. The sex abuse crisis is also turning out to be the greatest challenge of Pope Francis' pontificate.
That's right, Wyatt. Pope Francis is still working on recovering from his botched handling of the abuse scandal in Chile earlier this year, when he repeatedly discredited victims of a Chilean predator priest. And that was followed by accusations by retired Vatican ambassador Carlo Maria Vigano that Pope Francis himself rehabilitated Cardinal Theodore McCarrick. Now, as we know, McCarrick is accused of molesting and harassing adult seminarians. The Pope has yet to respond to those allegations, although he has, Wyatt, ordered a limited investigation.
Okay, we'll continue to follow all of this as well as the upcoming meeting in February itself. Juliet Lindley, EWTN News Nightly Vatican correspondent. Thanks.
Thank you, Wyatt.
We will have more reaction to the sex abuse crisis and the upcoming February meeting a little later in the broadcast. A judge delays the sentencing of President Trump's former national security advisor. The delay allows Michael Flynn to continue cooperating with the special counsel's probe into possible collusion with Russia in the 2016 election. Flynn pleaded guilty last year to lying to the FBI about his Russia contacts. The White House says it's working with Congress in an attempt to avoid a government shutdown. Press Secretary Sarah Sanders says President Trump still wants funding to build a border wall, but he's willing to pull some money from other departments to do it. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Wyatt. If the two sides don't reach a deal by Friday, then a quarter of the federal government will shut down. Today, the White House seemed to express more willingness to compromise with Democrats, but President Trump's priority to build the wall hasn't changed.
We need border security. Thank you very much.
The president says it's too early to say what will happen with the looming shutdown. Press Secretary Sarah Sanders says she's disappointed Congress hasn't passed a funding bill to keep the government open. Now, congressional leaders have been negotiating since the White House indicated earlier in the day that the president does not want a government shutdown over his demand for the $5 billion border wall.
We're looking at every avenue available to us possible. The president's asked every one of his cabinet secretaries to look for funding that can be used to protect our borders and for give the president the ability to fulfill his constitutional obligation to protect the American people by having a secure border. So we're looking at the other
Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer responded to the White House press secretary. He says no other parts of government, no other departments can fund the wall without congressional approval. And Schumer says that approval isn't coming, plain and simple. Wyatt?
Mark, is any progress being made over funding negotiations on Capitol Hill?
Well, Senator Schumer says the latest proposal coming from Republican leadership would not pass either the House or Senate, but Majority Leader Mitch McConnell believes they will agree on something. He says today he's convinced there will not be a shutdown. Stay tuned, Wyatt.
All right, will do. White House correspondent Mark Irons reporting. Thanks, Mark. The Trump administration is moving to officially ban bump stocks. The devices allow semi-automatic weapons to fire rapidly like automatic firearms and were used in the October 2017 shooting in Las Vegas. Bump stocks will be illegal beginning in late March. President Donald Trump's School Safety Commission lays out dozens of suggestions to improve safety in America's schools.
It's critical to have armed personnel available at a moment's notice. These are people, teachers in many cases, that are the highest trained that you can get.
The School Safety Commission was formed after the Parkland, Florida shooting that killed 17 students and staff. The new report makes relatively few recommendations on gun regulation, an area that many had expected the panel to tackle. Arizona's governor has named Representative Martha McSally to fill the Senate seat that belonged to the late John McCain. Martha McSally heads to Capitol Hill after narrowly losing her Senate race to Kyrsten Sinema in the midterms. Senator John Kyle took the seat after John McCain died in August. McSally is pro-life and was endorsed by National Right to Life. She will serve until the 2020 election. Mississippi's Attorney General has filed an appeal in support of a law to ban most abortions after 15 weeks. Last month, a judge struck down the plan, saying it violates women's constitutional rights. Mississippi Right to Life says it is hopeful the court will recognize the humanity of unborn babies. A priest in the Diocese of San Diego is convicted of sexually assaulting a seminarian. Father Juan Garcia Castillo faces 6 months in jail on a misdemeanor sexual battery charge. Father Castillo denied the contact between the men was sexual. Legislation that would ease federal sentencing laws for some offenders clears its first major hurdle. Supporters say it will lead to lower incarceration rates. Opponents say it's soft on crime. Passing the law would also give a win to President Trump, who backs criminal justice reform. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi reports. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Wyatt. This bill has overwhelming bipartisan support. 82 senators voted to move it forward. The bill would give judges more flexibility when sentencing federal drug criminals, and it bans the shackling of pregnant women, and it rewards some federal inmates for taking rehabilitation classes. Currently, nearly half of federal prisoners are arrested again after they're released. This bill tries to tackle that problem. Lawmakers who back it say the changes would make the nation's criminal justice system fairer, reduce overcrowding in federal prisons, and save taxpayer dollars.
Almost everybody in prison will serve their time and get out of prison. The question for us is, will they be better prepared to live life on the outside in a productive way?
The bill follows the lead of states like Texas.
Texas is now seeing its lowest crime rate since 1966. We want strong communities and institutions. We want those who have done wrong to be punished and then to seize their own redemption without state interference. Most of all, we want safe neighborhoods, neighborhoods that allow each and every member of our society to flourish.
But critics are pushing for changes.
This bill has more red flags than the Chinese embassy.
Louisiana Republican John Kennedy tells me the legislation is based on a faulty premise.
They're assuming that our sentences are all unjust, and they're going to fix it by giving virtually unfettered discretion to the bureaucracy to release whomever they want to. And I think that's backwards.
Democrats say new proposals to the bill would unravel bipartisan support.
Despite what some of the opponents of the bill claim, the legislation is certainly not a get-out-of-jail-free card for violent criminals or sex offenders. It's simply not true.
This bill would only apply to federal prisoners. They make up less than 10% of the country's prison population. President Trump persuaded the Senate Majority Leader to bring up this vote before Congress adjourns. The U.S. Bishops' Conference and Catholic Charities USA are urging lawmakers to pass the bill. Wyatt?
So can we expect a vote before the Christmas recess?
Yeah, it looks very likely, but Republican Senators Tom Cotton of Arkansas and John Kennedy of Louisiana are suggesting changes. One would require that victims be notified before a prisoner gets early release. Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois calls these proposed amendments poison pills.
Correspondent Jason Calvi reporting from Capitol Hill. Thanks, Jason. Russian President Vladimir Putin says he will look into the reported persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses in his country. Russia officially banned the denomination last year. Nearly 100 members face charges, with more than 24 in jail. Pope Francis tells politicians it's unacceptable to blame migrants and the poor for problems in society. He made the comments in his annual peace message. The theme is the need for politics to promote peace. The Pope says arms, terror, and nationalism all pose a threat. Pope Francis makes more changes in the Vatican's communication department. Italian journalist Andrea Torninelli will be responsible for coordinating the Vatican's editorial operations. Italian writer and professor Andrea Mona will become the editor of the daily newspaper. Pope Francis has made several changes to the Vatican's media operations over the past few years. Coming up, we get reaction after the Vatican reveals details of a February summit on sex abuse. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby, in for Lauren Ashburn. Archbishop Bernard Hebda of St. Paul and Minneapolis is urging the Vatican to reveal the status of an investigation into alleged sexual misconduct by his predecessor. Archbishop John Neinstead was forced to resign in 2015. He denies the allegation. The Vatican has not commented on Hebda's request. The Diocese of Salt Lake City releases the names of 19 priests and other clergy members credibly accused of abuse. Most of the alleged abuse occurred before 2002. The Salt Lake Tribune reports one priest is in active ministry but will retire next month. Salt Lake City is just the latest diocese to name accused priests. The New York Times recently examined the growing trend. One abuse expert tells the paper 35 dioceses have made their list public, with more on the way. The New York Times says, quote, "If releasing the list was meant to diffuse the anger of the church's critics, there's little evidence of having done that." Join me now by Skype from New York City is Matthew Schmitz, senior editor at First Things, a religious journal. Matthew, is releasing the names of clergy members who are credibly accused a step in the right direction?
Absolutely. There are more steps to be taken. One of those steps is addressing the fact that right now we're only getting the names of clergymen, for the most part, who are accused of abusing minors. A lot of abuse occurs where the victims are legal adults. And that's kind of been swept under the rug. We talk a lot about pedophilia. That ignores the issue that often these are cases dealing with sexually mature people, usually young men or older boys. And it'd be good to see that expanded. And another issue is the question of, what does credibility mean? Is this merely a way for bishops to avoid liability? Or has there been a real substantial judgment of credibility, or good men being lumped in with bad? So I would say it is a good step, but there's a lot more to do.
Okay, so the faithful have been waiting for details about the Vatican, about the summit on abuse in February. Today we heard the Vatican is urging bishops to meet with victims before coming to Rome. What's your reaction to that?
It's a good idea. But Wyatt, I have to tell you that I'm skeptical about this abuse summit at the Vatican, simply because, whatever the consultation is, ultimately the new measures will be put into place by the people who are running the Vatican. They've been there for 5 years. They have a track record. I don't think it's a strong one. The main focus of this pontificate has been mercy, and a lot of people have welcomed that. It's been very good. But when it comes to abuse cases, I think we've seen the downside of a focus on mercy. In 2012, we had Don Mercedes, Mauro Anzoli, an Italian priest who was accused of abusing young boys. The Congregation of Doctrine and Faith recommended that he be defrocked. Francis did not take that recommendation at the urging of certain influential friends of Anzoli's. We know that in certain things that have been submitted to Francis, his own words on mercy have actually been quoted, and he recommended a lighter sentence. After that, in 2015, we saw that Anzoli was attending a conference on family in Lombardy. And then Anzoli was later convicted in an Italian criminal court of abuse of 5 different minors, an ugly story. And so we've seen how it's good to put protocols in place. It's good to say we're going to have new strict rules. But if there's a prevailing ethos that downplays protocols, downplays rules, and says we're going to do it in a personal, improvisatory way, that can lead to bad outcomes.
Well, just to follow up on that, on the pontificate issue, as you know, Pope Francis is under pressure and scrutiny, and many Catholics have high expectations for this summit. In your view, what can he get done, if anything, in the 3 days that will satisfy the faithful who are angry?
I would say if we see that real action is being taken, that people are being held accountable, that justice is occurring as well as mercy, then the faithful will be satisfied. Even if not much happens in that 3-day meeting, it'll be fine if people walk away from that, and the men who are actually running the Vatican, ultimately they're going to walk away from that meeting and decide what they want to do. If they then start taking a harder line, similar to what we saw under Benedict XVI, that would be good. Benedict took a bit of a harder line than Francis has. He took a harder line than JP2 did. It was not a perfect line, not at all. But it was a harder line. It'd be good to move back toward that.
Okay, we'll continue to follow this. I know that abuse is a tough thing for a lot of Catholics to talk about, but it is important that we bring all this to light. Matthew Schmitz, Senior Editor at First Things. Thanks so much for talking with us.
Thank you, Wyatt.
Up next, a Catholic author tells us about his book on mythical mammals. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby, in for Lauren Ashburn. A Catholic educator and author is helping young readers to develop their moral imagination. Mr. Mehan's mildly amusing Mythical Mammals combines poetry and the visual arts to teach wit and wisdom together in the service of a holy life. Lauren Ashburn sat down with its author, Dr. Matthew Mehan.
Matthew, welcome to our broadcast.
Thank you very much.
What inspired you to create this illustrated world of mythical mammals? And the alliteration I have to commend you on.
Yes, thank you. That's right. M5 was essentially an homage to Thomas More. I studied him.
Another M.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. Whose last name means the fool. You got to play the fool. I studied him and realized how important poetry was for communicating truth and love and friendship. And he spent his life training up at night, writing to practice these arts so that he could bring peace and virtue to his people. And so I started writing some poems at night after teaching. And then this thing kind of snowballed over the years into something much more.
On the surface, it's a really fun way for kids and to bring families together, maybe read with your mom and your dad and get them off of their devices.
That's right. That's right.
And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on bringing families together.
I wanted this to be a family book precisely because of that issue of we need a kind of communal way to experience a book again. And then as you grow up in that communal experience of a book, hopefully families, individuals can break out and read on their own more. But that's why I actually made this book have multiple levels. One is little letter blocks for little kids. They can trace the letter.
At the very beginning, right?
Yeah,
so you begin with that at the beginning.
Yeah, and each of the poems has a letter that for the alphabet. So each mammal, B,
the blug.
Exactly, right.
It's like Dr. Seuss. You make up words.
Right.
The blug.
Oh yeah. Globular is in there. That's
Colvano.
Exactly.
Right.
Who's sort of a messed up version of a volcano.
He eats rocks down deep in the earth.
But it also has rhyme and meter, which is a little more complicated for older readers, even though the kids like the meter, and it has vocab for middle grade readers.
This was great. I learned a word too in this. So in the back, You say regarding those big black letters, so you give, Mixie the Moth, admiring Milk Moon's midpoint, mirrored in a memorable mirror. You need, you have an M in your name, Matthew Mehan. Did that have anything to do with the M's?
Yes. No,
you love M's.
M's. Well, the reason why it's mythical mammals is because we actually need to get back in touch with our nature, which is mammalian. Like we're made in the image and likeness of God, but part of that is also that we're made as material creatures. We have a body, and recognizing the material, the mama, the Mother Earth, the mammalian nature of us. Matt Mehan, Gospel of Matthew, he's the human part of Christ, right? The Gospel of Matthew is the humanity of Christ. That's what's on feature in the Gospel of Matthew. I took that seriously as a calling, that I wanted to teach people about the human part, not just the divine part, but the parts of us that are particularly human, which happen to be the mammalian, huggy bear, fuzzy mammal part of us.
Before we let you go, Matthew Mehan, would you read a passage for us from your book, one of your favorites?
My favorite for parents, because I assume parents are reading this one.
Yes, I read it.
Yeah, and it's Christmas time, so it's my favorite for the Christmas season.
The stage is yours.
It's the letter F, the fa-la-las. In winter the children are often misled as visions of Christmas lights dance overhead. Mothers are human and fathers forget to say to their littles what ought to be said. And that makes for children who simply don't know that when pine boughs grow heavy with holiday snow, in the trees there are creatures whose joy is to glow, blinking distinctly a winter rainbow. Children will point at their colors with awe and think that electrical light's what they saw. Alas, with their silence, mammas and papas will fail to speak of the wee fa-la-las. But look, listen, now is your chance. On the glistening snow, the bright fa-la-las dance. Sing in their songs they still sing as they prance. The fa-la-la-la-la, la-la-la chants.
Beautiful, absolutely beautiful. Or, you know what I should say? Magnificent.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming here. Dr. Matthew Mehan, author of Mr. Mehan's mildly amusing Mythical Mammals. Thank you for joining me.
And our thanks to Lauren and Dr. Mehan for that interview. The White House releases the official Christmas portraits. President Donald Trump and First Lady Melania Trump are seen in the Cross Hall of the White House, featuring Christmas trees in the background. The Vice President and Second Lady posed for their official portrait at the Vice President's residence at the Naval Observatory. And finally tonight, how do you go from being a bartender who has not attended Mass for 15 years to becoming a priest? You could ask Juan de Caceres. He's now Father Juan, and in the Diocese of Santander in Spain. He rediscovered God during the Spanish economic crisis in 2006 and says being a bartender was actually good practice for his current job because he often heard the confessions of his patrons. He also says, quote, God is very insistent. Always nice to hear about a person's journey back to God, and who knows, maybe he'll inspire more vocations. Well, that concludes our newscast for tonight. We thank you for watching. With the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We'll be back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night, and God bless.